Scene. Rhode Island, 1780. 1780. There is a man there, William Ellery Channing, son of a lawyer, grandson of a member of Congress and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And George Washington even used to stay in his home. I dropped this, but it's not our property. The town William is born into is a town of both the liberal elite and also the liberal elite who still live in a system of oppression. We would call it slavery. We could also call it human trafficking. And there's a quite unsettling comfort with both being a liberal intellectual and the enslavement of human bodies. A liberal thinker and one who also moves right alongside the constant holding and controlling of human life. This is the context within which Unitarianism becomes created. So this faith tradition that we now find ourselves within, their late 1700s, early 1800s, a form that came from Europe and now is in the United States, is taking root on the East Coast. Now it was Harvard, it was lawyers, it was the wealthy, intellectual, white elite that were thinking of this religion. Channing was the top of his class, constantly asking his professors for more Enlightenment materials, more science, more philosophers. Please give me more. Beyond the written curriculum and the written syllabus, there was always a request, please, I want to read more and more beyond this. Now, this is an interesting time in our religious tradition. Things are uneasy between the Christians at that time. The Congregationalists, who had developed their own sense of congregational polity, which means that congregations choose what they do, were quite uneasy. Liberal Christianity was quite suspect. They were called hypocrites who must actually secretly be from England. Now there, Unitarianism had taken a very nice white elite form, because there was a radical Unitarianism, but that's not necessarily where our tradition sadly comes from. There in Harvard, what we experience is a nice form, but it's radical. 3 ways of being Channing starts to talk about. One is what we brought up earlier from Pam, the Trinity. The first challenge was the idea that, in fact, actually, maybe there wasn't 3 separate beings. Perhaps Jesus Christ was not a separate God from the rest, but maybe Jesus was an invitation to holy living. Maybe Jesus was human, and maybe his humanity, the way that he showed up in the world, the way that he moved through the world, was an invitation for how we might live closer to the divine, rather than seeing Jesus as the divine. Now, that is a radical theology. It might seem ordinary now. I'm not sure how many of you have made that theology leap, but the idea that Jesus and human beings actually kindled the spark of divinity, rather than divinity needing to be out there as something to be afraid of, was a radical theology. Now, the second challenge was that scriptural revelation, meaning the text, the Bible, was not the only form of revelation. That actually, when we bring our divine human selves to Scripture, that something more is revealed. When you bring your life experience to Scripture, when you bring your gender and your race and your life experience to Scripture, when you bring your sexuality to Scripture, when you bring your life story to Scripture, something more is revealed that is worthy and valuable. Now, those two ideas should seem really familiar because two of them show up in our principles. The inherent worth and dignity of all people. The idea that you are actually divine spark, that Jesus was not separate from us, but actually showed us ourselves. Two, that you have a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And that in that free and responsible search for truth and meaning, that you are bringing that notion of divinity to creation because in you, revelation keeps getting revealed. These, at the time, are radical theologies. And I don't know if it feels that way anymore. I don't know if it starts to get kind of watered down or not, but if you really think about it, if I were to say, where do you put your body? Then Unitarianism would say, you put your body because your body's divine and so are the other bodies. And you put your mind because your mind and your imagination is important revelation, that God is not done speaking through your life. Through your life, Scripture is revealed. Now, although that was challenging to the status quo of some, the interesting thing about that theology is that it didn't actually require anyone to change their behavior. So people who maybe formerly were skeptical about the belief of what God was could change their belief about God, but it didn't actually mean they might change who they were as wealthy, white, human trafficking people. So they could feel good as the Harvard elite, because now they were on the right side of theology, the Enlightenment side of theology, the scientific side of theology, the reasonable side of theology. But still, the move was, oh, I have the right ideas now. It didn't actually require that they change their behavior. Now, at that time, it was so popular among the elite. Harriet Beecher Stowe actually writes this, and I'll read it word for word. All the literary men of Massachusetts were Unitarian. All the trustees and professors of Harvard College, Unitarian. All the elite of wealth and fashion crowded Unitarian churches. The judges on the bench were Unitarian, giving decisions by which peculiar features of church organization so carefully ordained by Pilgrim Fathers were carefully nullified. So I know sometimes in our context here in Arizona, in the United States, Unitarians, we feel like we're a small denomination. I want you to just briefly imagine what it would be like to be the Harvard elite, to imagine that you are on every judge bench, to imagine that you are the wealthy and the powerful, to imagine that that your tradition is what's in power to have a say in what happens in people's lives. Now, in that, Channing becomes surprisingly popular. So popular that he becomes even more bold in his theology. The next move that he makes is the idea that if we are divine, and if revelation is revealed through us, then that if we move towards revelation and truth and reason, that we're ultimately always moving towards the good. That we're always moving towards the good. Now that's transformative and that's meaningful for that time. And it's very different than the God that many of us grew up with, a God that we were supposed to fear, because instead this becomes a God that we're supposed to move toward and find power and inspiration in. And it's powerful to imagine that. And there are limits to that theology. Why do we talk about the limits to that theology? Well, for Channing, his popularity didn't last long. I know, it's a sad story. Channing is confronted by radical and grounded abolitionists. So it's the 1830s, and Channing is given a book by one abolitionist and is given a couple of ministry discussions by other abolitionists who are saying, if you are a man of God and you are not involved in the complete dismantling of slavery, then you are not a man of God. So as Channing is confronted with this, he realizes what kept him away for so long. And one reason that Channing said, I stayed away from the abolitionists is because, they were kind of harsh. Sometimes they were a little too violent in their tactics. They were kind of uneducated, and I didn't really like the way they approached it. I don't think their approach was very good, so I didn't join them. Does this sound familiar of why we don't join movements? I don't like the way they're doing it. Actually, I don't think they're doing it the right way. If you said it like this, I could hear you better. Maybe if you're really nice, they'll know that you're an upstanding citizen and they'll do what you say. Now, Channing, after being confronted by these folks, finally makes a change, and he begins organizing like hellfire. So he becomes the front of protest meetings about slavery. He starts work on women's rights, tariffs, property redistribution, and he believed that people could be intellectually persuaded to change their behavior. What happens is that within a couple of years, the man that was considered the father of Unitarianism is now insulted in the street, almost basically loses his job as a minister. When an abolitionist famous in the community and his close friend dies, his own church, a Unitarian church, denies the memorial because they were abolitionist. Channing retires and within a few years dies. So a lot happened. A theological moment, the ideas, divinity in every person, revelation in every moment, and a move toward the good, and a historical reality. A theology that, although beautiful and transformative and inviting, did not actually require anyone to think differently about their behavior. They were comfortable with having the right ideas. They were the cool kids now, but they weren't willing to give up any of their power or do anything differently. Now, when behavioral change was called for, the theology of their church did not actually help them in making a physical behavioral change of their lives. So we now, as inheritors of that one strand of Unitarianism, because there are many, but that one's particularly strong, have an interesting challenge ahead of us. What's better than having the right idea? What's better than being right? Now, I've had a few moments in my life of being a Channing. We could even make it a verb and call it, did you chan it? Were you channing that? Totally channed it. When I was living in Los Angeles, I was a member of White People for Black Lives, which was the white community organizing group working with Black Lives Matter, specifically on de-incarceration. So Los Angeles has the biggest jail in the United States. At any point in time, over 17,000 people are being held in jail in Los Angeles, over 50% of whom are pre-trial. What that means is that they actually haven't been convicted of anything yet. They just don't have the money to get out. The Los Angeles County jail system is a behemoth. Twin Towers, one of these buildings that stands in the middle of the city, close to where I used to live, is the largest mental health facility in the United States because so many of the people who are being held there experience mental illness. A mental health facility. Now, White People for Black Lives and a coalition that was working with Black Lives Matter in LA do weekly events at the police commissioner's meeting. And at these events, many people show up. We sit in seats and different levels of engagement with both the police that surround the area and the commissioners, who are a civilian oversight panel that are supposed to oversee the police, engage about whatever's happened that week. Now, one time I showed up, trying my best to show up in the physical to de-incarceration work that we were doing in LA. And I remember the feeling as people began to stand up out of their seats and to speak very directly to the powers that be. I imagine those judges sitting up on their little platform. And as people were speaking and as we were yelling and as we were chanting, in my own self, I felt my panic. What if we talk to them really nice? Have you felt this before? Yeah. I'm a minister. I almost have a PhD. Dissertations are hard. What if I go to the front and I tell them I'm a minister and I almost have a PhD in community psychology and they're really doing a bad thing? I mean, moral persuasion works, right? Right. As if I had the answers all on my own, and if we were just nice enough, if we sat quietly enough, if maybe I wore my stole, if I had a reason to wear my stole, we could actually do something. I was so overwhelmed with how do we do it right? How do I get them to agree with me because I'm right? How do I make sure we don't do anything wrong? Right? When we debriefed after the event, several of us got together in a circle, and it was incredible how many people in their bodies, as they're about to do something they know is right, how many of us feel stopped by the fear of what would happen if we do something wrong? How many of us want to be perfect before we do something? Or how many of us want to know every single thing about it before we're willing to agree? If you don't give me all the information, I don't believe you. If you're not perfect enough yet, I'm not joining you. This is a brilliant strategy to keep the status quo. The fear that if I don't know enough or if I do it wrong, I shouldn't do it, is a brilliant strategy to keep power in place. Our fear of doing it wrong keeps wrong going on. Now, if I think about what a faith tradition could have done to support me, I think about the potential of our churches as training grounds to a theology that would allow us to be wrong, would allow us to be imperfect, would allow us not to know everything until we get there, would allow us to say, actually, maybe there's something better than just being right. Maybe it's about being related. Maybe the thing that's better than being right is being in relationship. Now, the story also reveals that having the right ideas is not just a transformative religious practice. Beyond having the right idea is our willingness to show up because the relationship matters, not to show up because I can prove once more that I know, that I'm expert, that I have the right idea. So what if all those people around Channing had experienced a theology where they were not just encouraged to use their minds? And what if they had been given a theology and co-created a theology where they learned that being wrong meant being in with the sacred? And what if, our churches were places where we knew not just how to do the right idea, but what if they were training grounds for being in right relationship? It is our potential here to be such a place and to be such a people. May we be up to the task. In that inspiration, we want to invite you to join us in our next hymn, number 131, Love Will Guide Us.